Hello and welcome to the radiotimes.com Doctor Who podcast, but you probably knew that because you're already listening to it. My name's Hugh.
My name's Morgan.
And this week we are, like the Doctor, going back into history. Not specifically the history of Doctor Who, although that is also true, but the history of Doctor Who's history episodes or historical episodes. This is sort of sprung out of, slightly arbitrarily, it's the anniversary of Radio Times' first ever Doctor Who cover, which was for William Hartnell's story Marco Polo, which is also a very obviously early Doctor Who historical episode. And we thought, it might be fun to kind of use that as a springboard to talk about. It's a very specific thing in Doctor Who, right? We have episodes that are about monsters, we have episodes set in the present day, but the Doctor Who historical, it's more consistent in its form. You usually have the Doctor meeting a sort of famous sort of celebrity. Some people call these the celebrity historicals, don't they? Like you have like Simon Callow and as Dickens and so on, and then you also then have like in some way commenting on the present day through the lens of the past, and there's obviously like a sci-fi twist in some way. But yeah, I mean, I guess you could say the historicals are really kind of one of the things in Doctor Who that harkens back to its original founding, right? Like it's one of the kind of key tenets that they were going for.
Yeah, it's like part of the show's original format, that kind of Reithian edict that it had to both educate and entertain. That was initially the idea that Doctor Who would be partly educational for children, which is why you had stories about Marco Polo and about the Aztecs and about the Crusades. And I think it's interesting actually how the historical episodes have evolved over the decades, because you started off with what fans call pure historicals. It's one of those fan terms that no one in the real world actually uses, which was and people talk about those pure historical episodes a lot, like they are kind of a central tenet of Doctor Who. But actually, I was looking, and so I was surprised to see there have only ever been 12. Now I think that's right. If not, Wikipedia has lied to me, and I apologize to Doctor Who fandom as a whole. But I think only 12 of these pure historical stories, by which I mean it has no other sci-fi elements other than the Doctor, their companions, and the TARDIS. And those kind of went out of fashion more or less by the end of the 60s, or even the mid-60s. And then you have what fans again call these pseudo-historicals, which is what you touched on, where it's a story with a historical setting, with historical characters, but there is some other sci-fi element, usually an alien presence interfering with historical events. And then it wasn't totally kind of out of the realm of things for the Doctor to meet a famous historical figure in the classic series, certainly not. But I think it might have even been Russell T Davies who coined the term the celebrity historical, where that idea is certainly more prevalent now, isn't it? Where, like you say, you have the Doctor meet Charles Dickens or Vincent van Gogh, or more recently Rosa Parks and Mary Shelley. That is a format that continues on to the Chris Chibnall era.
Definitely, and I think you see it evolve as well. Like, I mean, it's kind of always been used to reflect things, but we've said before the Chris Chibnall era has definitely kind of leaned hard on the kind of social storytelling of these historic episodes. Like Rosa famously is obviously, it's about racism in a way that Doctor Who hasn't like overtly tackled. You've done it analogously with like the Daleks and so on, but it's never been like really, and Thin Ice as well, I suppose, but it wasn't like the point of Thin Ice, but it's the point of Rosa. And the same way where you have that a bit with the Witchfinders was kind of about gender inequality essentially, and also mud monsters. And that had Alan Cumming, obviously big celebrity historical. That was I can't believe we got Alan Cumming in Doctor Who for like one episode where he dressed up as James I. But yeah, no, it's kind of it's one of the things I think that people have said. I know people people have their opinions and people have like pros and cons for any era of Doctor Who, but I think one of the things people definitely say about this current era is it does say something with the historical episodes. Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror, that was kind of one that kind of, it was interesting in that it focused on this kind of, not a background figure in history, but, a far less famous figure in history, and kind of made Edison a less positive figure. And I think it can be quite interesting. But yeah, no, I mean, I really quite enjoy the historical episodes. It's interesting the thing you said about pure historical, because it immediately made me think, is in the future, is Arachnids in the UK a pure historical? Bear with me. because although it's set in the present day, it is one of the
Mm.
few episodes where there's not really any outside influence on what happens. It's obviously sci-fi in that they're like genetically modified spiders and someone pours toxic waste on them, but there's no alien interference.
Yeah.
It's technology that is said to be available on Earth. There's not like an alien spider involved or anything.
No, that's true. Give it long enough, and technically, arachnids in the UK, it marks the return of the pure historical. No, I did think it was interesting looking on. So again, if you look on Wikipedia, there's a list of Doctor Who pure historical episodes or stories, and a list of these pseudo historicals, and it lists under pseudo historicals Remembrance of the Daleks, the Sylvester McCoy story. And I was like, is that historical? Because I think when you think of historical Doctor Who, you think specifically of like him going back to the time of the cavemen, or meeting Marco Polo, or meeting Van Gogh, or whoever it might be. A story set in the 1960s, which is what Remembrance of the Daleks is. That seems like, oh yeah, I guess technically that is a historical, but it's a slightly different take on it.
We haven't had too many historicals that are set since the series began, have we? Not like where that's the main setting. I mean, I guess we've had a few 1950s, which is still
Idiot's
slightly
Lantern and
yeah, Idiot's Lantern, and I thought of another one that I've forgotten what it was now. But then you have episodes that have elements of like that, like Blink is sort of 60s, but not very much.
No, I suppose the further back you go into history, the more alien it feels, right, to us as a viewer and to the Doctor's companions, who predominantly most of the time are kind of a present day figure. So that's what's fun about historicals as well, is they can feel like historical Earth can feel as alien to the viewer, to the companion, as an alien planet. And so the further back you go, the more that effect is amplified, right? Whereas
Definitely.
if you go back to I mean, obviously a lot has changed since the 1950s, 60s, 70s, but it's not as jarring.
No, definitely.
And part of what I enjoyed about the pure historicals from the 60s, and part of the reason why I'm campaigning for them to make a comeback, I think it'd be great, is a lot of the time there wasn't necessarily like one singular threat for the Doctor and his companions to face. It was more just this idea, this feeling that they were trapped in history and they had to get out. Like they were cut off from the TARDIS a lot of the time, they from the ship, and they just had to somehow get away from this situation they'd found themselves caught up in, and escape and get back to the TARDIS and just run away, essentially. Like, they weren't, because it was history. That's another thing that's nice about it. Because it's history, because it's a fixed point in time, they weren't there to in many ways to kind of overthrow the villain or to fix anything. They were just looking to get out alive. And I think that's a really interesting story to tell. And actually, like, when not pure historicals, but the Chibnall era, you've seen a couple of examples that touch on that. So like Rosa, one of the great things I think about that episode is that the sci-fi elements aren't too strong. I was really afraid that there was going to be something where, you know, the Doctor says something to Rosa Parks that inspires her to take a stand, and it's not. It's very much doesn't rob Rosa of her agency. It's very much her decision. And similarly,
they were really careful about that.
well, and good, right? And similarly, like Demons of the Punjab, it feels like an episode where, to a certain extent, the Doctor and their companions have to walk away and just let history follow the path that we know it followed. And I think there's something interesting about that, about just kind of not interfering and not necessarily saving the day or fixing everything, because it's history. You can't just about getting out alive. Like, I think that's a really interesting story to tell.
I mean, you know, that is a theme as well of certain episodes, like you know, Fires of Pompeii. Is, you know, you can't change history, even though there is an alien reason that that's happening. I mean, the Doctor kind of makes it. It's kind of the trolley problem, isn't it? If a Doctor kind of makes Vesuvius erupt to you know, save the world, and then, you know, he can't save anyone because it's a fixed point. Which kind of brings me on to be honest, something I was thinking about earlier, which is, you know, sort of a celebrity historical from the Doctor's perspective. Bear with me. I was thinking about Waters of Mars. I don't know if there's any things like, obviously that isn't real history, but it is one of those occasions where it's a historical event he's aware of, he knows who they all are, and it's a historical event he says he can't change. And I thought that was I think that's quite interesting. Like, you haven't really seen too much of that, I don't think.
No, and I felt like that was a really nice twist at the time, actually,
Mm.
because the question that always, always presents itself when it comes to the time travel in Doctor Who is, well, why is established history that we know of as humans living as we do now? Why are those fixed points in time? Why can't the Doctor change history back then? But it's totally fine to overthrow an alien regime on the planet Zog in the year 3000. Like, surely that is also history from a certain perspective.
Definitely, yeah.
But no, it's always specifically the Earth history that we are aware of that happened in a certain way that can't be changed. Funny that. But actually, no. Waters of Mars does address that head on and go, no, actually, this future moment is a fixed point in time. It's history you just don't know about yet, and these are key historical figures. You just don't know them yet. So that was actually a really nice twist on the historical.
I think so, definitely. It also reminds me of like the interesting thing, obviously, to us about the historicals is that it tells us about human history. And I remember there was that period, well, not that really that period, but in the episode Voyage of the Damned, when he's like, "Oh, I'm going to take Astrid traveling," and I'm like, "Is he going to have to go to loads of like Stowe history, to entertain her?" It's like, "Oh, look, it's the Emperor of Stowe." And she's like, "Oh my god, I always wondered what he looked like." And at home we're like shrugging, like, what's going on? Like, it's one of those awkward things where like the logic of Doctor Who, you have to suspend a little because obviously it's a TV show for people on Earth in history that actually happened.
Well, something that fans sometimes complain about is that, especially the modern era of Doctor Who, that a lot of the companions are from the present day.
Yeah.
Right, and it was slightly more varied in the classic series. You did have companions from Earth's past and alien companions, but I do think, I mean, there's an argument for it, because I do think having present day companions, the whole, from our Earth, the whole point is that they're the audience identification figure, right? That you see things through their eyes, and that's especially true if you're going back into Earth's history and kind of they're having the exact same reaction to meeting Rosa Parks or meeting Vincent van Gogh as we would.
Sure.
So it works. I suppose you can make the argument that if a companion is not of this Earth, not of our time, there's an educational angle there, because they have no idea who this historical figure is, which would allow the Doctor to then explain some of the backstory of who this person is, why they're so important to Earth's history, without it feeling too heavy-handed. So there's probably a way around it, but I do think it works having that audience identification figure hail from our time, so that they, like I say, they react to certain situations and meeting certain historical figures in the same way that we probably would.
Definitely. I think it's just one of these things you just have to accept as a weird quirk of the Doctor, that he or she, like, as they go through their life, they correspondingly move through 20th and 21st century history to pick up new companions. No, not sure why, but they just do.
Yeah. When Doctor Who aired in the 1960s, funnily enough, picked up a lot of people from Earth around about that time. And when Doctor Who aired in 2005, funnily enough, he picked up Rose from round about 2005. Just, it's one of those things you just don't want to question too much. Don't pick at that thread.
Don't pick at it too much. Although, as Doctor Who fans, we obviously will. We should mention as well, we actually asked Chris Chibnall back in 2019, so quite a while ago, about pure historicals and whether he'd fancy them. I think the latest example, and Morgan, you wrote this, you can fact check me, was the Peter Davison story Black Orchid in 1982.
Yes, it is, but Black Orchid's an interesting one. So the last classic historical, if you like, is the Highlanders, which is Patrick Troughton's second ever story.
Which gives you a sense of how long ago they were like, nah, let's put aliens in them.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I think the idea around the time was that kids weren't responding as well to the historical stories. They liked having an alien monster in there, So that's another argument as to why maybe pure historicals don't work, is that, do kids struggle with the pure historical stories? Are they arguably more dry? So they did dry up with the Highlanders. And then there is a story, Peter Davison's story from the 1980s, Black Orchid, which is pure historical in the sense of it's set in Earth's history and it doesn't feature any alien menace really to speak of. But it's an odd story, really. It's slightly different in that it's not set in a very established, there's not an Earth event, historical event, of which we are all familiar with as the backdrop, especially. The Doctor doesn't meet a famous figure from history. It's just a story that happens to take place on Earth in the past. So it's like it's a slightly more left field take on historical. So I would say the last kind of classic format pure historical is the Highlanders, but technically the last one is Black Orchid. That was probably far more information than you needed on that, but I just thought I'd clarify.
Yeah, I thought you might just say, yeah, that's right. But you know, that also works. That also works. But no, anyway, basically, yeah. The thing that Chris Chibnall said when we asked him was, he said, I mean, similarly to what Morgan said, I thought Rosa was really, really close to pure historical. There's just the one sci-fi guy with a vortex manipulator, which is Krasko. I was interested to see how that went down, because that felt like probably the purest historical in terms of the priority component being historical. Probably since the show came back, I would say I'd happily revisit the format. I mean, we haven't done it yet, but there's no rule against it. And then he said he really loves the historicals and says that they can be really resonant. Maybe it's because we're living in such a time of flux that historicals seem to have an even greater resonance at the moment in different and very surprising ways that you can't really predict. So yeah, I'm very open for any writers to come along and go, here's your pure historical. So I'm sure all the prospective Doctor Who writers listen to this podcast. They've often told me. That's not true. I don't speak to anybody. So, you know, so there you have it. He's open to it. I mean, it's an interesting idea. I think I think it would have to be kind of like, there'd have to be something else going on these days. There'd have to be a twist on it. Like, say, like they get trapped there for like by some unusual. I think technically, if some unusual thing, like if say like the Master trapped them, you know, in the middle of a historical battle or something, and then the episode was them getting away from that battle. That's not a particularly good idea, but that's like, you know, something that could happen. That would probably technically be a pure historical, because although there's a sort of sci-fi element in them getting there, there's always a sci-fi element in them getting there. So
yeah, that's the thing. There's no such thing really as a pure historical in Doctor Who, because every episode features a alien who can change their face and a time and space machine disguised as a police box. So there's always that. But I think the rule, I don't know who makes these rules, but I think the rule is that if there are no additional sci-fi elements on top of Doctor, the time displaced companions, the TARDIS, like you say, the method of how they arrive there isn't really important. But so long as there's no aliens interfering, I think that's mostly there. Like if there's no aliens,
we'll give it to him. Yeah, like you say with Rosa, like Krasko's there and he's interfering, but he's basically just a guy. Like it's basically what would happen if a guy from the future came and started doing things that are like, he broke a bus. Do you know what I mean? Like he didn't like shoot anyone with a ray gun. He's quite like specific in what he can do.
Yeah, but I think part of the argument, quite a strong argument for the return of the pure historicals, is Rosa is largely hailed as one of the best, if not the best, episode from the Jodie Whittaker, Chris Chibnall era, right? But I don't think anyone particularly is like, do you know what my favorite part was? That guy Krasko, he was great. He was a great character. Yeah. And there's nothing against like the writing of the character or the performance of, I think it was Josh Bowman, but it's more just like, that wasn't the most memorable part of the episode. The most memorable part of the episode was the stuff that is based on real history. It was the Rosa Parks character, is what she did. It was how that was presented as part of the drama. I think you could quite easily have taken Krasko out of Rosa and that episode would still have worked and wouldn't have lost that much. And so I think creatively there is definitely scope to do a pure historical Doctor Who episode. I think the thing you come up against is would younger viewers accept that? I don't like to kind of underestimate younger viewers, but I guess that would be the question that people would ask is, you know, are people interested in Doctor Who if it's not the Doctor battling Daleks or Cybermen or some alien meanie? Does that sort of story still work for Doctor Who in the modern age?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, there is part of everything. If you just do it well and if you just serve it up, people will like it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I think, because I think, like you said earlier, most viewers aren't thinking about it in these terms of being like, wait a minute, this is a pure historical. Where's the sci-fi element? You know, I think they're just like, oh, is this a good episode or not? I don't think people would even necessarily notice the difference if it was done well. Like, and I think the challenge is like, Doctor Who, as much as it is very different week to week, it does have a kind of format that we're familiar with, you know, and part of that format is we're somewhere, there's some alien nonsense going on. It's basically, and you know, when you're in the historicals in the present day kind of work similarly in that it's like, ooh, alien nonsense is going on, and that's incongruous. Whereas like if you're in like an alien world or on another planet, it's like alien nonsense is going on and it's unusual even for here, you know, or it's like, you know, it's
Yeah.
in context for here, but there's something else to it. Like it's so I feel like the it's sort of like saying, you know, you could do an episode that's set on Earth and the Doctor just gets like arrested or something. Like it's just like it's not necessarily what you kind of come to Doctor Who for. So I think maybe that's the thing you'd run up against, whether it's, you know, easy or possible to write a good Doctor Who episode that fits that thing. I don't think it's impossible. I'm just like, you know, it would mean breaking out of the Doctor Who format, which could be a really, really good thing, but it could also just not work. I mean, I think you'd need someone really, really smart to do it. I mean, like you say, to be honest, Demons of the Punjab isn't a million miles away because the aliens in that don't do anything. They just stand around and watch people die. That's literally their whole.
Yeah.
That's literally their whole vibe, isn't it?
But all, yeah, no, exactly. I think both Rosa and Demons of the Punjab could have functioned effectively as pure historicals. And actually, you make a good point in the sense of it's because we haven't had a pure historical episode for so long. Actually, you could present it now almost as a twist. That absence of alien activity could be so something like Countryside, the Torchwood episode, right?
That's a really good analogy, yeah. And I was thinking a little bit like Listen as well, where you think there's a monster and maybe there's not.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, exactly. So, and there's also an episode of Supernatural, The Benders, which is very similar to Countryside. And came first. But anyway, this is the Doctor Who podcast, so maybe I shouldn't say that. But yeah, let's take Countryside as the example where the Torchwood team investigate what they think is an alien threat, and it turns out to just be some humans doing horrible, horrible things. And so is there the potential for that, you know, an episode where the Doctor suspects there's some kind of alien interference, and no, in fact, it's not. It's just history playing out, and there's a more kind of grounded threat. That could be quite interesting.
I think I'd quite like to see that. I'd be interested to see whether they do that. I mean, like, it's one of it, when we asked Chris Chibnall about it, it sounded like he very politely was like, "Oh yeah, yeah, that's interesting," but like wouldn't necessarily implement that in any way. So I don't know if we'll actually see one.
I feel like he, you know, Chris Chibnall is one of us. He is like a Doctor Who fan. He's steeped in the show's history. He knows that pure historicals are a thing by virtue of the fact, you know, we know that because he understood what the term meant when you asked him the question. He knows also like how great they can be. Like he's aware of those classic stories from the 1960s, like the Aztecs and the Crusade and the massacre and all these great stories that were pure historicals that worked really well. So I think he knows that Doctor Who can tell those stories, but I think he's also probably quite savvy. And as I said, there are other concerns here. Like there's probably, if he said, I want to do an episode, I want to do a story that's just about this event in history, and that's kind of it because that event in history is really interesting, there would probably be some questions asked of, yeah, okay, where's the alien menace? Where's the thing for the kids to latch onto? What can we make a toy out of in this episode? Like, which is that kind of more purely cynical side of it. But it is the kind of stuff you need to think about when you're showrunner of a show like Doctor Who. It's like, I guess maybe the writer in him would want to do a pure historical episode, but maybe the showrunner in him knows that it's a tough, or at the very least, it's a very tough thing to pull off and yeah, to sell. I'd say it's definitely a harder sell. Like we know for a fact, like, and again, you're saying, well, yeah, I want to bring back this thing that Doctor Who hasn't done properly for decades. And it's like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. People know that the Doctor fighting aliens is something that in whatever time period is something that audiences respond to. Who knows how a modern audience would respond to a pure historical now? It is definitely more of a risk. So you can see why they might be hesitant about going there.
Definitely. I mean, that makes sense. So, you know, maybe we'll see it in the future. Maybe we won't. But I do have a question for you, which we haven't prepped. So sorry for putting you on the spot. I just thought of it.
Oh, no.
What historical, like, special or storyline would you like to see in Doctor Who that hasn't been done before? We did ask people this once, quite recently, actually. And again, if I'd prepped, I'd have this written down. We asked some people what they'd like to see in the next series. And some people did have some interesting ideas. Let me see if I can remember what those were. But Morgan, for now, do you have any thoughts?
I'll just talk until you've managed to dig that up. It's interesting, isn't it? I think the trouble is there's probably so many historical events that would be interesting to explore in Doctor Who, so many historical figures it would be interesting for the Doctor to meet. But if you look up, if you search on Doctor Who Wiki, I'm sure you'll find that it's been covered off by, if not on TV, then by a Big Finish audio or by a book or by a comic. Can't believe to say we're running out of history, but it does feel a little bit like that. I think there's definitely areas that Doctor Who has touched on that could be explored in more detail. Like there's the start of the first few episodes of Patrick Troughton's final Doctor Who story, the War Games, where the Doctor and the companions find themselves in the middle of World War One. Or at least they think it's World War One, and then it turns out this isn't. That's kind of, they almost like pull the rug in a different way there, where you think the TARDIS has landed in World War One, and it turns out it's a recreation of World War One on an alien planet, and it's like, twist, it's actually sci-fi. But I think that would be really interesting. Like, this is how my fan brain works. But when I was watching the film 1917, all I could think was, let's make an interesting Doctor Who episode. Like, I do think it would be interesting, again, throwing back to that classic pure historical 60s notion of the TARDIS lands somewhere really dangerous and they just have to get out. Like, I think actually something like that, maybe with a World War One setting, could be really interesting and wouldn't require any alien interference. There's certain periods of history that are
just dangerous,
big, just dangerous, right? And big and scary and strange enough that you wouldn't necessarily need a sci-fi element to make it work.
I mean, to be honest, the plot of 1917, like, say if the Doctor was cut off from the TARDIS and they've realised that the only way to save some people is to like kind of run across, the front essentially. Like, that's not a bad idea. Do you know what I mean? Like, kind of the Doctor kind of wanting to save like one person or a few people without any of the sci-fi tricks, just kind of has to like run essentially.
Yeah,
that kind of works.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, you could even do like the whole episode in real time, and it's like 45 minutes of them landing and then escaping at the end, but they just have to survive for 45 minutes in real time. Like, something like that, I think could actually be really interesting.
I think that would be quite cool. I've given up trying to find whatever the fans said because I can't find it. But yeah, I think basically there are definitely some periods in history that haven't been explored. It's always a lot easier once they're kind of announced though, and you're like, oh yeah, what an interesting idea. Like when I heard they were doing partition, I was like, what a good thing to do about in Doctor Who, because I learned about it terribly from a film called Viceroy's House or something, which is probably not the best depiction of it. But it's a really interesting period in history, not something we're taught about, certainly in the UK. And then I feel like it really filled that sort of educational mandate. And then apparently, rumour has it that season 13 is going to include Mary Seacole, who was obviously, she's kind of a contemporary of Florence Nightingale in terms of she was a real pioneer in treating wounded soldiers and stuff like that. And immediately, as soon as they said her, I was like, God, yeah, what a perfect kind of subject for this era of Doctor Who, because obviously Mary Seacole was a person of colour, and she like is kind of often forgotten in history. We learned about her in school as the kind of, oh, she's the one who we don't remember. And I feel like that's sort of similar to Nikola Tesla, in Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror. It's like highlighting these slightly unseen figures. And also, the way that like they went for Ada Lovelace over Lord Byron, which is interesting, the mathematician versus the really famous poet. I do think that the kind of choices it's making are quite interesting. And yeah, I guess I'm sort of like, maybe a composer would be quite interesting. I don't think we've had too much of that, certainly not in the modern series. Like, I think you could do, like the Shakespeare episode was obviously really good. And I'm sort of like, imagine if you could go back in time, meet a famous composer. Like, has Mozart been in Doctor Who? I feel like Mozart must have been in Doctor Who.
I definitely in spin-off media. I'm trying to remember if Mozart's made any kind of like cameo in a TV story, but there's never been the Doctor meets Mozart as the main thrust of a TV story. I'm pretty confident in that.
Yeah, I feel like something like that would be quite cool. And then, music can kill the alien or whatever, some nonsense like that. But I feel like something like that would be quite cool. We've had a few writers with like, Shakespeare, Agatha Christie, Dickens. Obviously, to be honest, there's an extent to that in that it's writers writing these episodes, so they're quite interested in writers. I think it would be interesting. We've also had scientists. I think it would be interesting to see like other kind of creative people and, people like that.
Well, you had an artist in Van Gogh, right? And
That's true.
that's hailed as, again, one of the all-time great Doctor Who episodes by a lot of fans, Vincent and the Doctor.
To be honest, I meant to mention that earlier. That is probably one of my favorite historicals. It's obviously, it feels very different in a way. It's much sort of more languid in kind of, even though there's a lot of running about. And also it has that weird wish fulfillment moment at the end where they just bring him to the future and say like, look, everyone loves you and you're really famous, which is kind of normally the Doctor says like, your books will be remembered forever. And but then in this one, they're like, oh no, come and have a look. See?
Yeah. I did feel like there was a point to be made there, though, because I think, again, they were almost trying to like fix history. Like they thought, oh, if we show this to Van Gogh, like he never knew how, he was so unappreciated in his own time, he never knew how much he'd be celebrated later on down the line. We should show him, and then he won't take his own life. And then he did, because it's not as simple as that. And so I thought that was really nice that they made that point.
Yeah. Also, I mean, on a separate note, for 2010, a pretty forward-thinking depiction of depression and how that works. I mean, if it was made now, we'd be like, oh yeah, totally, that fits. But I feel like in 2010, that's pretty. I think it still stands up today. I mean, not that 2010 was a very long time ago, but it's quite a sophisticated look at it, I think.
And like Doctor Who is always uses, as you said earlier, right at the start of this, it can use science fiction elements to comment on certain themes and societal issues. But it's also like the historical episodes present a really like clear way, right, in which you can do a really clear way in which you can a more direct way, really, that you can comment on issues that are still impacting us today. You can say, look what happened in Earth's history, and look how it still is happening now, or look how things have changed since then. So you can comment on like present day Earth. Such a weird thing to say, but you can comment on like how our lives are today through sci-fi, but you can also do it through a historical lens. It's something Doctor Who has done in the past and done really well, and it's something that I definitely hope it continues to do, hopefully with the return of pure historical. I'm still campaigning. Hashtag bring back the pure historical. That's going to be the push for this episode.
I can see that that gaining such traction as we go forward. I mean, I think as well, to be honest, with the historical episode, the present day parallels can even fall a bit better, because these things did actually happen. Whereas sometimes if it's like, oh look, there's racism, but in space, that's like oh, this might happen. It's a bit heavy-handed. Whereas if you're like, well, no, look, here's like an issue we still have now, but here it is several hundred years ago. It kind of, and we know that this did happen in some form or another. We can clean up the language a little and kind of emphasize the point to make it seem more similar to present day, but it's there. I feel like that's kind of, if anything, that's kind of makes more of an impact, right?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a strength that is something the historical episodes have over the sci-fi episodes, is that you can be more direct in making those comparisons and conveying whatever message you want to convey.
Definitely. I'm interested, actually, maybe we'll get a pure historical next series. Maybe if as rumoured, there's a Mary Seacole story. We don't know that for sure. Maybe that could be a pure historical. I think I did see that there were some Sontarans running around, so maybe not.
Good old Doctor Who. You're like, maybe that could be a pure historical. Nope. Sontarans in the middle of the Crimean War.
They actually just run around in the background, and that's it. Like but it still ruins it. Yeah, but it's actually all about very historical. But there's a Sontaran waving in the background, and they just ruins it. He can't let us have it. Chris Chibnall won't let us have the pure historical. Start a petition. But yeah, no, I'd be interested to see. I mean, I'm sure that we'll get more than one historical episode, even though it's a shorter series. To be honest, probably easier to do at the moment. Historical episodes, lots of big houses, that can't have visitors in COVID land. So maybe they'll be like, yes, please come and do a story about Marie Antoinette dodging a Dalek or whatever.
That actually sounds pretty good.
Yeah, to be honest. And at some point she can be like, let them eat cake, and she smushes cake on a Dalek for some reason, really forcing it in.
Yeah, just like covers up its eye stalk with like a bit of Victoria sponge, and
yeah, that'd be
perfect.
Right, have a big food fight. I mean, this is some classic stuff. I mean, again, all the Doctor Who writers who are definitely listening to this, if we see any of this, without an inch of credit, you'll be hearing from our lawyers. You won't be. We can't afford the lawyers. Anyway, yeah, no, I'm interested to see what they come up with. I'm always quite interested in the historical episodes, and like I think in some ways there must be a challenge, especially as the longer you go on, the fewer kind of big name historical people there are to kind of go for. But there's always somebody, the fact that we only just had Rosa Parks really relatively recently is quite interesting. And then you have like, James the First and stuff. Like there's always monarchs and there's always like these key historical figures you can play around with.
Yeah. No, I said earlier that like, and I said earlier we're running out of history, and I was being facetious. Like, of course not. There's still plenty more periods of history that I'm sure Doctor Who hasn't explored, like key historical events that could be really interesting if given a Doctor Who twist. Loads of prominent historical characters that would be really interesting to see the Doctor meet. Like you said, we haven't actually seen really an episode centered around the Doctor's relationship with a musician. Like that's a whole other thing that could be explored. So I'd say there's definitely plenty more history for Doctor Who to explore.
Would have been cool for Peter Capaldi to meet Beethoven after that whole bootstrap paradox.
I felt like they were building to that, and yeah,
never really played out. The second Doctor with his recorder could have done it, and he could have had Peter Capaldi with his guitar. Would have been great. But there you go. So those of you listening, I mean, we maybe should have done this before because you could have helped us out. But are there any historical episodes you'd like to see? Any key historical figures that you think would make for a good visit? And any periods that you feel are relatively underserved in Doctor Who? And would you like to see the return of the pure historical, or do you think it's better left in the 60s with most of Morgan's ideas? He's fine. I'm joking, really. Let us know in the comments or on Twitter at Radio Times if you're so inclined. And you never know, if any of them are really, really great ideas, we may talk about them on a future installment of the podcast. We also might not, because other stuff might come up. Anyway, we have been chatting about Doctor Who for a while, so we will end it here and see you next week when we'll be talking, hopefully, about an anniversary of something that happened in Doctor Who. But I won't say more in case I change my mind about what we do. Until then, I've been Hugh.
I've been Morgan.
And this podcast has now become part of the tapestry of history and can thus be visited by Doctor Who. Thanks for listening and goodbye.